Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre virtually. How nice for you to be at home and be here with us at the same time. This is great. There are a few more people coming in as I speak. You are very numerous, which is lovely. And we are going to have a nice evening, I think. We're very lucky this evening to have Rupert Sheldrake with us, one of the best known people in what I would loosely call our field, I suppose. I mean, these Tuesday talks, the aim is to see where science and spirit, or science and the paranormal, or science and the alternative meet, taking perhaps the more intellectual approach to the whole business of spirituality and paranormality. And of course, Rupert is like gold dust to us because he's a real scientist, had a long career as a real scientist, and is completely open to all forms of science, and has invented some forms of science of his own, which just the way that Galileo and Darwin did, so he's in good company. But he also writes books and lectures and talks about the spiritual and the interface between the two of them. He fits completely with our slogan for these Tuesday talks, open minds, open minds. Rupert's written 10 books. I think I've read all of them. I strongly recommend them to you. They are both informative and attractively written. And the one on spirituality is as good as the one on dogs who know when their owners are coming home, or the one which is a new science of nature. Tonight he's going to talk to us about a central issue in all our thinking when we are considering philosophical or psychoanalytic or psychological approaches to being human, which is to try and find the right balance between the important thing that we have in our skulls called our brain and the other important thing which we have called mind or consciousness. And he's done a lot of research in this area, much of it very interesting. And it's about that he's going to talk this evening. So without more ado, Rupert, the floor is yours.
Very good to be with you, Lance, and all at the Conan Doyle Centre. I'm speaking this evening about the mind beyond the brain, and you're all familiar with the conventional view, which is that minds are nothing but the activity of brains. The standard view, which is taught in universities, taken for granted in medical schools, taken for granted in psychology departments, is that minds are what brains do. And the assumption is that our minds are nothing but the activity of the brains, and of course, they're inside our heads. So if they're inside our heads, then, and that's all there is to it, then there's no way in which they could influence other people at a distance or be open to spiritual influences, because this is a materialistic worldview which paints a picture of a universe which is nothing but unconscious matter, evolving with no purpose whatever. And everything in the universe, according to materialism, is supposed to be unconscious. Unfortunately for materialism, it turns out that we're conscious. And this is a terrible embarrassment for materialists. It's called the hard problem in the philosophy of mind, because we ought to be unconscious like everything else. So they try to explain consciousness away. We're not really conscious at all. Consciousness is just an illusion, or it's just an epiphenomenon, or just another way of talking about brain processes. Well, the trouble with this is that there's no evidence for it. For a start, it's simply an assumption that the mind's nothing but the brain. Obviously, it's linked to the brain and related to it in some way. But the idea it's nothing but the brain is simply an assumption, and it conflicts with a great many facts. What I'm going to do this evening is look at the idea of the mind extended out far beyond the brain through fields, mental fields or perceptual fields. Now, we're all used to the idea of fields because science is currently based on them. The electromagnetic field pervades the entire universe. It's what carries radio waves and light waves. It's what makes your computer work now. And we're more familiar, I suppose, with magnetic fields. So if you have a magnet, the magnetic field is inside the magnet, but it also stretches out around it. It's not simply inside the body of the magnet. It's an invisible structure that stretches out beyond it. Now, the same is true of gravitational fields. The gravitational field of the Earth is inside the Earth and stretches out far beyond it, keeping the moon in its orbit, for example, and all the satellites that circle the Earth. And the field of your mobile telephone is an electromagnetic field. It's inside the mobile phone, but it stretches out far beyond the boundary of the physical object of the mobile phone. That's why the phone works, because of these invisible connections through the electromagnetic field. So what I'm suggesting is that our minds are like that they're normally associated with our brains, but stretch out far beyond them. And the easiest way to see how this might be relevant is to think of vision. What's happening when we see something? What's happening when you see me now on your screen? Well, you all know the standard answer that light is coming from the screen, going through the electromagnetic radiation of light into your eyes, going through the lens, inverted images in the retinas, impulses up the optic nerve, regions of activity inside the optical cortex and other bits of the brain. And these have all been tracked and described in unprecedented detail thanks to brain scanning. But does that explain vision? Well, no. First of all, it doesn't explain why you're conscious of what you see. That's part of the hard problem. And secondly, it doesn't explain why you're experiencing an image of me on a screen in front of you instead of electrical and chemical changes inside your brain. The image you're seeing of me is not experienced by you, I imagine, as being inside your head. Is experienced as being on a screen in front of you. Now, what I'm suggesting is so simple that it's hard to understand, and that is that the image you have of me on the screen is located exactly where it seems to be on the screen and not inside your head. In other words, I'm suggesting that light moves in, changes happen in the optic nerve and the brain, but then images are projected out through the eyes to where you're seeing something. It's not quite dark here, and if I look out of the window, I can see a tree, and I think my image of the tree is located where the tree actually is. I don't think it's inside my head. If I look at the stars, when it's a bit later, it's quite clear tonight, so I'll be able to see the stars and the moon. My mind, I'm suggesting that the projections of my vision reach out to touch the stars or to touch the moon, that my mind stretches out through in vision over literally astronomical distances, if I'm looking at astronomical bodies. So what I'm suggesting, in other words, is that vision's a two-way process. Light moves in and images are projected out to where they seem to be. This is not a new theory. In fact, it's the theory of vision that's taken for granted in primitive and traditional cultures all over the world. And it's the theory of vision that Plato advocated and which was worked up in detail by Euclid, the great geometer, author of Elements of Geometry. Euclid was one of the first people on record to explain what happens when you see an image in a mirror. Euclid explained that what happens is that when you see something, you're projecting out these images. Because they're virtual projections, they're part of your mind, they go through solid objects. So when you look into a mirror, if you look at something in a mirror, the light is bent by the mirror, reflected, goes into your eye, but when you project things out, the projection isn't reflected by the mirror, it goes straight through it, which is why virtual images are behind the mirror. So every time you look in a mirror, you're seeing your mental projections. What you're seeing is in your mind. And even in physics textbooks, the images behind mirrors are called virtual images. They've got no other way of explaining it, basically, than Euclid's theory. But they have to pretend that it's not really there at all. And in textbooks, there's a dotted line behind the mirror. It says the vision is projected to the virtual image behind the mirror. But they don't explain how this projection works. They have to use the word projection. But what I'm suggesting is it really is projected, and that this two-way theory of vision is what practically everyone in the world believes except modern Western scientifically educated intellectuals. Children spontaneously believe it even here in the West. Jean Piaget, in his study of the child's ideas of the world and how they develop, showed that children assume that vision involves an outward projection of images. And that's why Superman comics show rays going out of Superman's eyes, and why Roald Dahl's story Matilda is so popular with children, because she has eye beams that can move things around. So children take it for granted. But by the age of 10 or 11, Piaget found that most Western children learn what he called the correct view. And the correct view is that thoughts and images are invisible things inside your head. And so the idea that images are projected out is totally taboo in modern academia, in science, and in philosophy, despite the fact that's what we actually experience. Again, this is simply an assumption that it's all inside the head. No one's ever found virtual images inside the head. All the images, the color, the 3D images you're seeing now, as you look around you, are supposed to be inside your head as a kind of virtual reality display secreted or generated by the nervous system. Yet in operations, brain operations, when people open up the skulls, they never see three-dimensional virtual reality displays inside the head. The assumption there is totally without evidence. Now, what I'm suggesting is not just a philosophical view of vision or of the mind, it's a testable scientific hypothesis. And if our minds stretch out and touch that which we're looking at, then we should be able to affect things just by looking at them. If I look at you from behind and you don't know I'm there, the question then becomes, could you feel when you're being stared at from behind? Now, as soon as you ask that question, you realize that this is a very simple, common phenomenon. Surveys show that over 90% of the population, including children, have had this experience, and it's found all over the world. Now, what does science have to tell us about this? Well, the answer is, until recently, virtually nothing. Between 1885 and 1985, there was a total number of 4 papers in the entire world scientific literature on this subject. 2 of them were written by skeptics, saying that this was a widespread superstition that should be stamped out by scientific education. And 2 were written by people relatively open-minded. One was by a student of John Belloff, who did the experiments in Edinburgh University, who found that people actually could tell when they're being looked at from behind. So the 2 people who'd actually done experiments found that this was a real phenomenon. But instead of the scientific world saying, wow, this is an incredible discovery, their papers were buried in the parapsychological literature and simply ignored because it's assumed this is impossible and it must just be a superstition. So when I started research on this, I always start my research with natural history and asking people about their experiences and doing questionnaires. And I found that actually most people have experienced this. It happens most often when people are feeling threatened or insecure, for example, in a dark street at night. And most of the experiences happen with male strangers. It also happens with people you know well, but the things that people remember most are with strangers who could be potentially threatening. And the emotions associated with the feeling of being stared at or looking at people and making them turn around involve envy, anger, and lust, or at least sexual interest. So they're not usually neutral these looks, and sometimes it's just curiosity. But these are things that most people have experienced. I then asked the professionals, people who look at other people for a living. Most of us are mere amateurs when it comes to this phenomenon. I interviewed the store detectives at Harrods, the people in charge of security on London Underground, people in the anti-terrorist forces, the drug squad at Heathrow, and other people who watch others. And among such people, it's just taken for granted. Of course, people can tell when you're being looked at. If you go on a training course to become a private detective, then when they're training you how to shadow someone, how to follow them, something I'm sure that Sherlock Holmes would have been well aware of, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, I don't know in his large corpus whether there's anything about this, but I wouldn't be surprised. But private detectives know that if you're shadowing someone, then you don't stare at their back, because they're likely to turn around, catch your eye and blow your cover. You have to look at them a bit or you miss or lose them, but you look at their feet. In the SAS, when people are being trained to creep up behind others to stab them in the back, they're told don't stare at their backs. They're likely to feel you coming, turn around and shoot you. In the martial arts, people actually undergo training in sensitivity to being looked at from behind, because it's highly useful to know if someone's watching you from behind, and it could save your life. So among practical people, there's no doubt that this phenomenon exists. But within the scientific and academic world, there's a culture of almost total denial. So I then started doing simple experiments so simple a child can do them, involving two people. One of them wears a blindfold over their eyes, the other sits behind them and then looks at the back of their neck in a randomized series of trials, either looking or not looking. Sometimes you're throwing a coin to decide whether to look or not look, or a random number generator in a random sequence. And these trials only last 10 seconds each. You hear a click or a beep, that means the trial's begun. And if you're the subject, you have to guess, looking or not looking. You might say looking. And in trials with feedback, you'd then be told right or wrong. Some of the trials are without feedback. Well, these very simple trials can be done through windows, through one-way mirrors, and they've shown overall incredibly positive, significant results. More than 100,000 of these trials have now happened, and the statistical odds against chance of this phenomenon not existing are about 1 billion to 1. So the evidence is strong, and it's also been done through experiments with closed-circuit television, where people are watched through CCTV by someone in another room or another building, and their blood pressure, their skin resistance is monitored with, like a lie detector, galvanic skin response, which measures physiological arousal. If adrenaline is going through your bloodstream, you sweat a bit, and that makes the skin resistance less. So it's a very sensitive way of measuring physiological arousal. And in these experiments, now replicated in several different universities, when people are being watched through closed-circuit television in randomized periods, they become physiologically aroused more than when they're not being watched in the control periods. And again, this is now highly significant positive results. So the scientific evidence suggests this is a real phenomenon. And even skeptics who've tried to refute it, who've done their own experiments, have ended up getting positive results, which they then have to try and explain away. There's a review of all this, which is published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. You can find it for free on my website. If you want the details, it's all in peer-reviewed journals. And on my website, in the section of research, under the sense of being stared at, you can find a dozen or so papers by me and others on the subject. I also discuss it in my book, The Science Delusion, and more fully in my book, The Sense of Being Stared At. So I think there's now very good evidence that this is a real phenomenon, which won't surprise most people, because most people simply take it for granted. People who are not very educated just say, of course, what's the big deal? Everyone knows this. But as soon as you enter an academic institution, you'll find lots of people who are eager to tell you it's completely impossible, there's not a shred of evidence for it, and it's all been refuted, and so on. And they won't be able to remember the details of the refutations or the lack of shred of evidence. Oh, I can't remember the details, but it's all been shown to be false. That's how skeptics react, by simple denial. Now, it turns out that animals are also sensitive to being looked at. I don't think this is a particularly human phenomenon. I think all animals with image-forming eyes project images out which affect what they're looking at. I interviewed wildlife photographers, deer stalkers, and other hunters to find out what their experience was. And deer stalkers and people who stalk animals to shoot them obviously do this in a way that they don't give clues to the animal. They don't crash around. They're very quiet, they're downwind, and so on. And what they all say, or at least all the ones I've interviewed, is that, say you've got a deer in the sights of your rifle, unless you shoot quickly, you won't get the deer because it'll feel you looking at it and it'll run away. And exactly the same is reported by wildlife photographers, even if they're taking photographs from within a hide where the animals can't see them and using telephoto lenses. But as soon as the animal's in their sight focus of their attention, then it will run away or become restive, or they won't get the shot they want. I think that this is a deeply instinctive response. I think it's probably evolved over many millions of years in the context of predator-prey relationships. A prey animal that could feel when a predator was watching it would escape better than one that couldn't. And I think that we have this not because we're special, but because we're animals. And incidentally, I think this is a completely normal ability. It's normal in the sense that 90 to 95% of the population have experienced it, that many animal species experience it. It's not paranormal. Paranormal means beyond the normal. And personally, I don't like the word paranormal or even the word parapsychology, meaning beyond psychology, because phenomena like this are not paranormal in the sense of extraordinary. They're incredibly common. And as soon as you say they're paranormal, you play into the hands of the skeptics who say, well, remember David Hume, that great Scottish philosopher, in his argument against miracles, who told us that anything that's very rare and unusual should be disbelieved because it's much more likely that people who report it are lying than something's true that goes against the common experience of humanity. That's Hume's argument. It's often used by skeptics as an argument against the paranormal. The trouble is, it doesn't really work for something like the sense of being stared at. That's something that is accepted by the majority of humanity, that's considered perfectly normal by people all over the world, whether educated or not, at least in their own experience. Educated people have been taught to deny it, but they still experience it. So I think that the word paranormal and parapsychology are perhaps giving the wrong impression. So this is normal, it's very common, it's very biological, and it tells us that minds extend beyond our brains, not just to objects in the direct vision where we're seeing them directly. The sense of being stared at also works through mirrors. I've done experiments with mirrors where you're looking at a virtual image behind the mirror rather than looking directly at the person. And as I've already mentioned, perhaps surprisingly, it also works through closed circuit television. And I dare say it would work through real television. If someone did an experiment where there's 1 million people watching someone on a TV screen, it might be much more detectable than when there's just one. That experiment has not been done yet. It would be too risky for anyone in television to do something so simple, interesting, and provocatively challenging the scientific paradigm. Anyway, this is the sense of being stared at is one way in which our minds extend beyond our brains through attention. And they remind us that the very word attention is about the stretching out of the mind add tendere to stretch towards. Intention comes to the roots in tendere to stretch into. So I think these very words tell us that our minds are stretching out, stretching into things. So that's the first point I want to discuss, the sense of being stared at, the extension of the mind through attention. Now I want to talk about the extension of the mind through intention. And again, I want to put this in a biological context. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about social groups of animals, because this is highly relevant to the measurable effects of intention through telepathy. All social animals, by definition, live in groups, and all social animals have to coordinate the activity of different members of the group with each other. Sometimes this is over very short time periods, like in a flock of starlings flying together in a murmuration. You can, and I'm sure everyone here has either seen them in real life or films of murmurations of starlings, where you see the whole flock change direction very rapidly without bumping into each other. Not only does it mean each bird knows where the others are, but it knows where they're going to go. And if it was just looking at neighbors and trying to figure out which way they're going, it would be much too slow. The reaction time of starlings is about 100 milliseconds. And the reaction time, the movement in response to neighbors is much less than that. It can't just be looking at neighbors. It's not physically possible. And even if they could see them moving in a particular direction, they can veer quickly after that. And you'd have lots of collisions. What I think is going on is there's a field, what I'd call a morphic field. Morphic is to do with shape and form. I think the whole social group has a field, and the members of it are within this field, rather like iron filings being within a magnetic field, which shapes the way they behave in response to each other. They're not just doing it by responding to their neighboring iron filing, they're responding to an overarching field within which they all are. I think schools of fish have similar social fields, morphic fields of the social group. I think herds of animals do. Packs of wolves, for example, are closely bonded. They're very social animals. And when older wolves go out hunting to bring back food for the cubs, which are left in the den, the field of the group stretches, as it were, doesn't break. They're still linked to each other. And I think these invisible bonds through the field of the group are what conduct telepathic impulses. They're the means by which telepathy works. There's already evidence from naturalists studying wolves in the wild that they seem to know what other members of the group are doing when they're many miles apart, far beyond the range of smell or hearing, and indeed in situations where they're not making howling noises or other oral sounds. So there seem to be telepathic links between these wild animals, and there's already observations from the field that suggest this. When I got interested in this, because I thought telepathy was likely to be a normal feature of communication within social groups, I started looking at telepathy in animals rather than people. Because I thought if it exists at all, it has to be a biological phenomenon, normal, not paranormal, natural, not supernatural. And so I started asking people about experiences with their dogs, cats, parrots, horses, and other animals. I made an appeal for information, and I got thousands of stories. I have a database now with over 6,000 case histories of seemingly hard to explain behavior by animals. For example, I've got well over 100 stories from people all over the world saying their cat seems to pick up their intentions and knows when they're planning to take it to the vet. It disappears. And so lots and lots of people have had the experience of the cat just seeming to know when they're going to the vet and hiding. Cats, on the whole, don't like vets. For some people, this becomes very annoying, and they stop letting the cat see them get out the cat basket. They don't mention the word vet. but the cat still seems to know. And some people in despair ring up the vet from work so the cat can't overhear the conversation, and then swing by after work to pick up the cat to take it to the vet. And it still seems to know and is in hiding. I heard so many of these stories that my colleagues and I did a survey of all the veterinary clinics in the North London Yellow Pages. We 65 clinics, asking if they ever had a problem with people missing appointments with cats. 64 out of 65 said it happens all the time. And the remaining one said, we've given up the appointment system for cats because it happens so often. People just have to turn up with their animal. So that's one area where animals are picking up intentions. And it's part, and people who own dogs and cats tell many stories about how they seem to pick up their intentions. The case where it's easiest to investigate experimentally is with dogs and cats that know when their owners are coming home. About 50% of dog owners and about 30% of cat owners have found that their animal seems to anticipate their arrival, or at least other members of their family have found that, because it goes and waits at a door or window when they're on the way home. Sometimes people know when they're on the way home because of the animal. I have more than 30 stories from women who've told me that their husbands work irregular hours as plumbers, taxi drivers, lawyers, journalists, etc. But they always know when they're coming home because the dog goes and waits at the door, and so they're able to cook their husband's supper so it's hot on the table when he arrives. I have to say the sample here is heavily biased. I've only had one case of a woman saying her husband knows when she's coming home and he gets her a cup of tea. This is something that's just of practical value in many households. And when I discussed this with a skeptical friend, to my surprise, he didn't deny the phenomenon. He said, oh, my dog used to do that. My mother always knew when I was coming home. And I said, well, how do you explain that? I said, how long in advance? Oh, about 20 minutes. And I said, well, you must have been at least 10 miles away in a car, the other side of Cambridge, with a lot of traffic noise. And I said, well, how do you think the dog does it? And he said, well, they've got sharp hearing, obviously. So I said, what if it isn't hearing? What if they can't hear you from 10 miles away or smell you, which seems way beyond their known capacities? And he said, well, they must be hearing or smelling me. How else could you explain it? So I said, well, okay, well, this is, he and I, he's a skeptic and we argue about these things a lot, but what we agree on is testing these phenomena by experiment. So we designed an experiment together, a simple experiment. The person with a dog that does this would go at least 5 miles away beyond the range of any known smell or hearing, and come home at randomly selected times that they don't know in advance in an unfamiliar vehicle. So there's no familiar car sounds or smells, no routine involved in this. And the people at home, if there are people at home, won't know when they're coming. And then you then film the place where the dog waits the whole time the person is out. Well, I've now done hundreds of experiments of this kind, videotaped experiments with dogs that know when their owners are coming home. And the results show they do it over and over again. The dog I've worked with most didn't do it every single time. It did it 85 times out of 100. It was massively significant statistically. But the times it didn't do it I looked into those to see did they have anything in common. In 2 or 3 of them, the dog was sick. In another one, it was very, very tired after a long walk. And in all the others, it happened when there was a bitch on heat in the next flat. What this showed was that the dog could be distracted. But on occasions when there wasn't a bitch on heat, when it wasn't sick or dog tired, then it went and waited at the door for its owner coming home. This is all published in peer-reviewed journals, and I asked a skeptic, Richard Wiseman, who's always on television as the TV skeptic, who's the partner of Caroline Watt, who's now Kirster Chair, a professor at Edinburgh University. he challenged me, saying it's all routine and or it's familiar car sounds. I asked him to do his own experiments, which he did, and he got just the same results. And I'm afraid he then pretended he hadn't, and pretended it hadn't worked. But in his experiments, the dog was, everyone who's seen the videos agrees, at the window 75% of the time on average of the period she was coming home. 75% of that period, the dog was waiting at the window, whereas when she wasn't coming home, this was averaged over 3 different experiments, it was at the window an average of 4% of the time, highly significant effect. Anyway, I've got a video that shows one of these experiments. This was filmed for Austrian State Television, ORF, filmed by their science unit, with this dog JT that lived, now dead, but lived near Manchester. And they wanted to do a proper scientific experiment, insisted on it, in fact, and I was perfectly happy for them to do that, because they could do what I couldn't do. They could film the owner as well as the dog. And so we could have a split screen presentation when she was told to go home. And and they told me they were going to do a real experiment and that they were going to broadcast the results, whatever happened. And they were very skeptical. They thought they were going to show that my claims were unfounded when subjected to objective scientific scrutiny. Well, the film, which Scott is going to turn on for us now, shows you this experiment. It's about 5 minutes. It's in German, the soundtrack, because it was for Austrian television, but it is an English-speaking dog, and it does have English subtitles, so hopefully you'll be able to follow this.
One moment.
Pam Spart ist eine Hundebesitzerin, die die Experimente von Rupert Sheldrake seit nunmehr 2 Jahren durchführt. Zusammen mit ihren Eltern versucht sie herauszufinden, ob ihr Hund JT tatsächlich immer weiß, wann sie nach Hause kommt.
JT, good boy. JT.
Ihre Eltern, bei denen der Hund während ihrer Abwesenheit bleibt, haben das Phänomen seit Jahren beobachtet. Pam selbst war zuerst mehr als skeptisch. Erst die Experimente mit JT konnten sie überzeugen.
We tried to fool him for 2 weeks.
2 Wochen lang haben wir JT richtig auszutricksen versucht. Ich habe meinen Eltern weder erzählt, wohin ich gehe, noch wann ich zurückkomme. Ich bin mit dem Taxi, mit dem Fahrrad, mit dem Auto von Freunden oder auch zu Fuß zurückgekommen. Es war eine Zeit intensiver Forschungsarbeit. Jeden Tag in der Früh habe ich mit Rupert Sheldrake telefoniert und wir haben vereinbart, welches Experiment wir heute durchführen.
Wir wollen es jetzt genau wissen und machen die Probe aufs Exempel. Ein Experiment mit 2 Kameras. Eine Kamera wird im Wohnzimmer der Eltern aufgestellt, in dem auch JT bleibt, wenn Pam das Haus verlässt. Um vergleichen zu können, was Pam und JT im selben Moment tun, werden die Timecodes der beiden Kameras auf dieselbe Uhrzeit gestellt. Der zweite Kameramann begleitet Pam und unsere Redakteurin. Es ist 11 Uhr Vormittag. Das Experiment beginnt. Weder die Eltern zu Hause noch Pam wissen, wann wir zurückkommen werden. Wird JT auch unter diesen Bedingungen reagieren und Pam am Fenster erwarten? Wir begleiten Pam in das nahegelegene Städtchen Ramsbottom. Nur wir kennen den Zeitpunkt der Rückkehr. Selbst der Kameramann, der mit JT zu Hause geblieben ist, weiß nicht, wann wir zurückkommen werden. In der Zwischenzeit daheim bei Pams Eltern. JT liegt nach wie vor bei den Füßen von Pams Mutter und zeigt keine Zeichen von Unruhe. Es ist kurz vor 13 Uhr. Die Hälfte der Zeit für das Experiment ist bereits abgelaufen. Das wissen allerdings nur wir. Denn, wie schon gesagt, den Zeitpunkt der Rückkehr halten wir nach wie vor geheim. Weder Pam noch ihre Eltern zu Hause wissen, wann wir zurückkehren werden. Ob der Versuch gelingen wird, ist nach wie vor offen. Niemand kann voraussagen, ob JT unter Testbedingungen wie immer reagieren wird oder ob Kamera und Scheinwerfer ihn irritieren. Nun wird es ernst. Es ist 10 vor 3. Unsere Redakteurin gibt das Zeichen für den sofortigen Aufbruch. Die Kamera zeigt die aktuelle Uhrzeit. Es ist 14:50 Minuten und 7 Sekunden.
Right, oh, we've got to go back now. Right, so I've got to...
We have to get a taxi.
Right, okay.
Where can we get a taxi?
You know where we were filming before?
Yeah.
I noticed there was a taxi right there, so you could knock on the
Okay.
door there. Yeah?
Okay,
Okay.
let's go.
So, right, go and get a taxi.
Yeah.
Um 14 Uhr, 50 Minuten und 33 Sekunden, 11 Sekunden nach unserem fernen Signal zum Aufbruch, geht JT ans Fenster. Das Experiment ist gelungen. Allerdings wissen wir das zu diesem Zeitpunkt noch nicht. Um es für den Hund noch schwieriger zu machen, haben wir uns schon vorher entschieden, mit einem Taxi zurückzufahren, damit JT das Motorengeräusch von Pams Auto nicht erkennen kann. JT rührt sich zu Hause nicht mehr vom Fenster weg, während Pam im Taxi auf dem Weg zu ihm ist.
We're going home now, Pam. Do you think of JT now at the moment?
Dabei spielt es keine Rolle, ob Pam an ihn denkt oder nicht. Genauso wie in den Experimenten, die sie für Rupert Sheldrake mit ihm gemacht hat, lässt sich JT auch diesmal nicht irritieren. Erwartungsvoll sitzt er am Fenster, als das Taxi vorfährt. Zugegeben, uns selbst hat das Ergebnis verblüfft. Erklärungen können wir Ihnen dafür keine anbieten. Wir erheben allerdings auch nicht den Anspruch eines wissenschaftlichen Experiments. Wir können Ihnen nur zeigen, was wir mit eigenen Augen gesehen haben.
Well, there you see for yourself this phenomenon. And I wouldn't mind betting that quite a few people who are watching now have dogs or cats that do this kind of thing. It's quite common. Again, it's normal, not paranormal. In millions of households here in Britain, this is going on a daily basis. And all over the world, this is happening. Probably tens, hundreds of millions of dogs and cats are anticipating their owners' returns every day. So this is normal, not paranormal. It's ordinary, habitual behavior by dogs. Luckily, when it comes to doing experiments, dogs are perfect subjects. Not only are they more sensitive telepathically than humans on the whole, but they never get tired of their owners coming home. The trouble with a lot of parapsychology experiments is they're very boring and repetitious, and the subjects get bored and the scores fall off, and then the skeptics say, there you are, there's no repeatable effect. Luckily, dogs never get bored of their owners coming home, so you can do these experiments over and over again. We haven't yet done a filmed experiment with cats, so if any of you have cats that know when you're coming home on a fairly reliable basis, do get in touch and if you want to take part in this research. And now everyone's got smartphones and webcams and things. It's actually much easier to do this research than when we did the experiment you just watched. Now, the same principles apply to people. If you look at the case histories of human telepathy, then they happen principally between people who know each other very well, between mothers and babies, husbands and wives, lovers, siblings, identical twins, close friends, therapists and clients, who've got transference or countertransference, they don't happen between random strangers. So again, I think telepathy is based on social bonds in the human realm as it is in the animal realm. Unfortunately, many parapsychologists who've tried to do rigorous scientific research have assumed that telepathy works between completely unrelated people selected at random. And in most parapsychology experiments till recently, they were doing experiments between strangers. And nothing could be less suitable for detecting these effects. I mean, they did find on average small, significant positive effects, but the effects are much stronger when you do the experiments with people who know each other well. I've done a set of experiments on nursing mothers and their babies. Many nursing mothers find that when they go back to work after the baby is a few months old, they may find their milk let down, their breast starts squeezing out milk for no apparent reason when they're shopping or work in an office or something. Now, this milk let down reflex is a well-known, well-documented reflex. It happens normally when a mother hears their baby cry. It's mediated by oxytocin, the love hormone, and it's a well-documented physiological response. But when mothers feel this, when they're miles from the baby and it's not a routine feeding time, almost all mothers assume my baby needs me. And they used to just go home. Now they ring home on their mobile phone. And they're usually right. And I've done a study with nursing mothers in London, which shows that the odds against chance, the letdown reflex happened when the baby really needed them at non-routine times. The odds against it being a chance effect were 1 billion to 1. It was massively significant statistically. No one has yet repeated this research with nursing mothers. And if any of you know people who are looking for research projects in psychology or midwifery or medicine, I think this would be a brilliant study to do, because now so many mothers have video baby monitors. They're actually monitoring their baby all the time, and that could easily be filmed. They also have mobile phones, so they could easily do a selfie when their baby cries, when their milk lets down, my milk's letting down now. And you could put them in a split screen, like the JT experiment. It would go viral on YouTube if someone did that, and it would greatly move forward the research on telepathy. Much more so, I think, than very artificial experiments in scientific laboratories. By far the commonest experience of telepathy in the modern world happens with telephones, telephone telepathy. You think of someone who you haven't thought of for a while for no particular reason, then the phone rings and there they are. And then you say, that's funny, I was just thinking about you. You know who it is when the phone rings before you look at the caller ID or answer it. 85% of the population have had this experience, according to surveys, in Britain, Germany, America, South America, all over the world. It's incredibly common. It's a kind of everyday experience for some people. Again, it happens with people you know well. It happens more with women than men in our surveys, and the most repeatable, successful combinations are mothers and daughters. Mother-daughter pairs. Well, what the skeptics say about this is, oh, it's just a coincidence. You think about people all the time, and if one of them then rings, you imagine it's telepathy. You just forget the millions of times you're wrong. Well, that's a reasonable hypothesis, but in the 100 years since, or more years since telephones were invented, not a single skeptic had actually tested this hypothesis. It's not enough in science to come up with a hypothesis. You need to test it. You need evidence. And I found that this very common armchair speculation was completely evidence-free. So I designed an experiment to test it. In this experiment, people who this happens to quite often volunteer, and they give the names of 4 people they know well, family members or close friends. We pick one of the 4 at random, ring them up, and ask them to think about their friend and then call them. They're being filmed. They're at home with a landline camera, no caller ID, no landline telephone. When the phone rings, they have to guess which of these four people is ringing them. I think it's Mary, they say to the camera and say, "Hi, Mary." They're right or they're wrong. By pure chance, they'd be right for 25% of the time. Well, these experiments have given massively significant results. These are all published in peer-reviewed journals. And this has been replicated at the universities of Amsterdam and Freiburg. And I think we just got time for a 5-minute film showing one of these experiments. I did this for television. Television people came to me and said they wanted to carry out one of my telephone telepathy experiments for television. And I said to them, well, I'm working with people who I know can do it because they've already done it and they're used to this. And they said, well, we don't want them. They're just normal people. We want celebrities. So I said, well, you can't just have random celebrities. They have to know each other well. And they got back to me and said, we found the ideal group of celebrities that know each other well. And they'd found the Nolan Sisters, a 1980s girl band, who are very close and turned out to be great subjects. Again, I had to sign an agreement that the experiment would be conducted just once and with one group of people with no more than half a day for the experiment. And the results would be shown on television, whatever happened. And again, they were expecting it to fail. And I had to take the risk of, most scientists wouldn't allow a single experiment to be shown on television, because even perfectly conventional experiments often don't work. Anyway, they did it. And now I can show you, Scott, if you could put on the Nolan Sisters experiment, we can all see that experiment.
If you look at the modern world, despite all discouragement, most people believe that they've had telepathic experiences. And interestingly, the most common kind of telepathy in the modern world is precisely one that's grown up alongside technologies. In other words, telepathy connected with telephone calls.
So many people tell stories of telephone telepathy that Dr. Sheldrake devised a test to see whether someone could predict who, out of 4 people, was calling them. The probability of being correct by guesswork alone was 25%.
We've now completed 1,000 of these trials, and the average success rate is 42%, which is hugely significant statistically. People certainly aren't right every time, but it's way above what you'd expect by chance.
So, is telephone telepathy real, or is it just a figment of the imagination? We brought one of the most successful girl bands of the 80s to London to find out. The Nolan Sisters are one of the closest families in showbiz. At the height of their fame, they spent months on the road together, and most of them still live within miles of each other.
I'm Rupert Sheldrake.
But how well will they do in the telephone telepathy test?
Now, could you tell me all your names in order, please?
Yes, I'm Denise Nolan. I'm the most intelligent one here. I'm Maureen. She's just Maureen.
Hi, I'm Linda, and Denise is a liar.
I'm Colleen.
Colleen is the youngest, and I'm Anne. I'm the eldest.
Why do you say that?
Because I want people to say I look good for my age.
Maybe you don't.
You don't.
Not really.
The first stage of the experiment is to decide which of the sisters will be the receiver.
So 4 of you are going to stay here. One of you is going to go to the hotel and try and guess which of the others is phoning. So we've got to pick the person to do that.
It's got to be Colleen.
Colleen is nominated by her sisters because she's the youngest. And while she's driven a mile away to the other location, Dr. Sheldrake allocates each of the other sisters a number between 1 and 4. For each trial, a throw of the dice will determine who will be the caller.
So we're going to start now with the first one. I'm going to throw the die. 2. There you are, Maureen. So you've only got 2 minutes.
Maureen's first up, and the rest of the group must leave the room to allow her to focus. When the phone rings, Colleen will have to say who she thinks is calling before she picks up.
Right. Maureen. Maureen.
Yes! Oh, yes! Yes! Thank God for that. Thank you. Lovely talking to you.
Bye.
Bye. I knew she'd get it. Yes. Bloody hell. Oh, sorry.
But that could just be coincidence. Next up is Anne, the only skeptic among the sisters.
Denise.
No, you're wrong.
With 4 sisters to choose from, if it's purely guesswork, Colleen should expect to be right 25% of the time by the end of the experiment.
Think of your favourite sister. The most talented one.
I'm not getting anything now. I don't want to be wrong. Linda. Linda.
Yes! Yes!
Good girl. You're not thick.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, bye.
Thanks for calling. Bye.
Bye.
Yes! That's good, isn't it?
Halfway through, and Colleen is a long way ahead of the 25% expected by chance alone. Anne's number has come up 4 times, but for the previous 3, Colleen has guessed wrong.
Anne.
Yes! Hooray! I knew you loved me, really.
3/4 of the way through, and Colleen's hit rate has reached over 40%. According to Dr. Sheldrake, this indicates there's more going on than simple guesswork.
Maureen or Linda, I think. Linda. Linda.
Yes! Yes! Oh, my God!
I'm so impressed.
I'm scaring them now. They're backing out the room.
They should never have gone in there with you, love.
Fantastic. Thank you. Bye. Wow.
Colleen's final score is 50%, one of the highest of over 1,000 tests conducted by Dr. Sheldrake.
Anyway, well done. I think that was great. Thanks very much.
Really enjoyed it. Well done, that girl.
Cheers!
Don't block my face.
Well, it was fun working with them, as you can see. I've done similar experiments with emails and SMS messages with very similar results. Again, these are all published in peer-reviewed journals, and you can find all the papers on my website if you'd like the details. And I now have an automated telephone telepathy test that works on mobile telephones. So I invite you to have a go yourselves. This is something I'm trying to encourage people to take part in. And I'd love it if anyone among you, and indeed I'd love it even more if all of you could have a go. You register through my website, sheldrake.org, O-R-G, and there's a participate section. You put in your name, your phone number, mobile phone number, and 2 other people with their mobile phone numbers. Actually, it works on landlines too. And what happens then is that at random time intervals thereafter, if I'm the subject, for example, and say Lance and Scott are the 2 callers, what happens is that the phone picks one of the 2, the computer picks one of the 2 callers at random. Say it picks Lance. Then it would ring up Lance, his phone would ring, it would say telephone telepathy test, and then he'd get a message when he picks it up. Say, this is Rupert Sheldrake's telephone telepathy test. Please think about Rupert. When you're ready, press 1. Presses 1. My phone then rings, and it says telephone telepathy test on the caller ID. And I get a message saying, this is your telephone telepathy test. One of your 2 callers is on the line right now waiting to speak to you. Press 1 for Lance, press 2 for Scott. So I make a guess, I press 1 or 2, I'm right or wrong, 50% chance of being right by chance. And the line opens up, and then I get to speak to either Lance or Scott, and I get instant feedback, whether I'm right or wrong. Then after a minute, it cuts off because I'm paying for the call. And after a random time delay, there's another trial. There are 6 trials altogether. Then everyone involved gets a message telling them the score. 3 out of 6 is the chance level. In these tests, the results are coming in pretty consistently, significantly above chance. And what I'm trying to find is people who can find ways of training themselves to do better in these tests. That would be a game changer if anyone can find how to do it, and especially if they can find how to train others. But lots of people are pretty good at this anyway, without any practice, because it happens in everyday life so often. So basically what I'm saying is that these phenomena, which I call the mysteries of everyday life, are normal, not paranormal. Things like the sense of being stared at, dogs that know when their owners are coming home, and telephone telepathy are extremely common. If you bring up the subject with family members or friends, the chances are that most people will have stories to tell about their own experience. These are not weird paranormal things where you've got to be someone like Uri Geller to be able to do them. They're perfectly normal things that you yourselves and many of your friends and family members have probably experienced. If you have any tiresome skeptical friends who say it's all rubbish, there's no peer-reviewed papers on it, and the evidence is unrepeatable, etc., that's simply a display of their ignorance. And if you look at some of these peer-reviewed papers, you'll be able to say, well, that's just not true. Do please have a go at this test if you can. I've now got another test that's recently put on my website, a joint attention test. Can you tell when someone else is looking at the same thing as you? You're online this is not on phones, but on computers. You can do it on your phone as well. And you're with a partner, and in each trial, you're either shown the same picture or a different picture, and you have to guess if the other person is looking at the same thing as you are. It's not exactly telepathy, it's the phenomenon of joint attention. It's not been investigated scientifically so far at a distance. So this is opening up new experimental ground, and I think that it's probably very important. I think our minds resonate with other people looking at the same thing. When people are looking at, millions of people are looking at the same thing on television, I think it creates large-scale mental resonance. This is a feature of the modern world, but it's not really been researched. And the joint attention test results are coming in positive and statistically significant. So I think there really is something going on there. Well, finally, I'd just like to say something about the difference between the psychic and the spiritual. Psychic phenomena of the kind I'm talking about, the sense of being stared at, telepathy, picking up attention and intention through the extended mind, these phenomena are normal biological phenomena. Most animals are better at them than most people. We live in a society where these abilities are discouraged, disparaged, not taught, not trained. In many other cultures, people value them and actually honor them and try to cultivate them. But in our culture, most people won't even tell their best friends about these things because they're afraid of being thought superstitious or stupid or pseudo-scientific or something like that. But the fact is, these phenomena are real. The reason they're controversial is because they go against the materialist worldview, which has become a belief system for many people, particularly for militant atheists. And so people like that get very angry at the idea these things might be real. And if you do have friends like that, just ask people in the room whether anyone's had the feeling of being stared at or whether they've had the experience of telephone telepathy. And you'll probably find most people there have had these experiences. There is evidence for them from experiments. And just see what happens to your skeptical friends. They'll be forced to try and dismiss everyone's experience in the name of a theory. namely the Materialist Theory, which is so at variance with the facts. Well, these psychic phenomena are about connections with the environment and with members of social groups. They're, as it were, horizontal. They're about survival-related things. They're not spiritual phenomena, which I think are to do with contacting other realms of consciousness beyond the human level. When people pray, for example, or meditate, or have mystical experiences, it's about our minds being open to a larger and usually non-human conscious dimension. Whether those non-humans are people who were humans, like in the spirits of the departed, or where they're actually prayed to, as in the cult of saints in the Christian, in Catholic and Orthodox, and to some degree Anglican churches. People pray to saints who are, after all, dead people, who are believed to be potentially present now and to be able to help people who are alive. Or people pray to God or have mystical experiences with the ultimate, the divine, ultimate being, the absolute, whatever word they may choose. Now, I think those experiences are more, as it were, vertical or all-around experiences where we're connecting with other forms and higher forms of consciousness. And I think they're quite distinct. They blend into each other, perhaps, but they're distinct from psychic phenomena. Now, dogmatic materialists and atheists are against both. They're against psychic phenomena and spiritual phenomena. But there are some atheists who are open to psychical research, who accept psychic phenomena but deny spiritual phenomena. And there are some religious people who accept spiritual phenomena but deny psychic phenomena because they think they're somehow suspect or perhaps diabolical or something like that. The point I personally am open to both. I think we have extended minds that work through psychic phenomena. I think we also have the possibility of connecting with spiritual realms, realms of consciousness beyond our own. And there are practical ways of doing that. Spiritual practices are all ways of contacting and connecting with other realms of consciousness. My most recent book is called Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. And it's about 7 different spiritual practices which have been studied scientifically. The scientific studies show they have measurable effects. Generally speaking, they make people happier, healthier, and live longer. And they have measurable effects on physiology, brain activity, and so forth, and well-being. People sleep better, live longer, and so on. These are all measurable effects. But the spiritual experiences themselves, I think, show that we can connect with other kinds of consciousness beyond our own. So that's it. The 2 ways in which our minds extend beyond our brains and affect our lives. Both areas denied by the official scientific orthodoxy of materialism, but both of them widely experienced by the majority of the population, and part of the human heritage in all cultures and traditions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Rupert. That was absolutely marvelous. That's a summary of so much of your research, so brilliantly and clearly expressed. I've been getting a few questions, and as I said, I will just read them from the chat feed. I think the first question that I was going to put to you, you've more or less answered in your last remarks. Brigitte and Robin have asked about a mind field, as they call it, not a minefield, a mind field. Can we influence others or project our perceptions onto others, and does it work through TV? Could I ask you just to say yes, since you've covered that?
Well, yes. Yes, I do think we can. And one thing I might add to what I said is that intentions reach out to affect others. My intentions could reach out to affect my cat or dog, which would know when I'm intending to come home. My intention to telephone you would reach out before I make the call, because I have to have the intention before I make the call, and you might pick that up. But intention also plays an important role in petitionary prayer, which I discuss in my recent book. In petitionary prayer, you're asking for things, and petitionary prayers start by invoking the spiritual being whose help you're asking. Our Father who art in heaven, Hail Mary, full of grace, Om Namah Shivaya. They all start with an invocation connecting with a spiritual realm. And then you form specific intentions. You may pray for someone you know who's miles away, who's sick, to get better. Now, in that case, I think the power of the prayer is coming from the spiritual source, but the way it's directed depends on you forming that intention. And that intention forms a link between you and that person or animal or situation through which this divine power can flow. So I think that it works together in the spiritual context as well. And most prayers are in petitionary prayers involve intentions of one kind or another.
Well, that's very good, because my next question from Benjamin Durham was, is there any technology? Could you imagine a development of technology which would, as it were, measure these intentional signals, that could sense them?
Well, what technologies do is sense things at their own level, as it were. Electromagnetic devices sense electromagnetic effects. Gravitational devices like pendulums or torsion balances used in determining the gravitational constant are measuring gravitational fields. They don't measure electromagnetic fields. So to measure gravitational effects, you use gravitational devices. To measure electrical effects, you use electrical devices. To measure magnetic effects, you use magnetic devices. And to measure effects that are to do with attention or intention, you use minds of people or animals. That's the detecting instrument. Okay. There's no particular reason why an intention should be detectable by an electrical meter or by some quantum spectrometer or something. You wouldn't expect to detect gravitational fields that way. So I think you can do experiments. I've been talking about experiments all along: staring experiments, dog experiments, telepathy experiments. These are all ways of measuring phenomena. They give quantitative results that can be analyzed statistically and plotted on graphs and that sort of thing. But they're not involving instruments. It's possible that one day there could be instruments, but I wouldn't expect it necessarily, because we're looking at the effects of one person's field on another person's field. They're detected by similar kind of receptor systems in other people. They're field phenomena, depending on these morphic fields, not electrical phenomena. They have electrical effects. They affect what happens in the brain. It's possible you could detect them indirectly, but I wouldn't expect them to be directly detectable.
That's great, thank you. And as usual, this leads directly into the next question. I've chosen an auditor, a viewer called Sangari, has wondered whether your notion of mind fields and morphic resonance and so on has any connection with quantum mechanics in the very general sense of the field theory that surrounds that bit of physics.
Well, yes, I think it does. I mean, there are certainly analogies in the phenomenon of quantum entanglement. Particles that have been part of the same system, in the same atom or molecule, if they move apart, remain linked at a distance. And this is called quantum non-locality or quantum entanglement. If a change occurs in one particle, instantaneously the other one is affected. And this is now used in quantum computing and quantum cryptography. I mean, this is a well-established phenomenon. Einstein thought quantum theory must be wrong because it had this phenomenon within it. He said quantum theory appears to allow for what he called spooky action at a distance. Therefore, quantum theory must be wrong. But experiments show that Einstein was wrong in this point, and that quantum theory is right. There really is a spooky action at a distance. But I think it's only an analogy, really. I don't think that I'm not in favor of trying to reduce all mental phenomena to the quantum level, which is the realm of microscopic physics. That would be an extreme kind of reductionism. I'm against reductionism. But if one interprets quantum theory in a much more broad sense, so the physicist David Bohm had an idea of what he called the implicate order, the infolded order, that the world we're living in is folded out from an invisible implicate order, which is apparent at the quantum level, but he thought something similar was going on at all levels of organization. when we had a dialogue about this, which is reprinted in the recent edition of my book, A New Science of Life. And basically, he said that the implicate order is modified by what happens in the explicate order. So if a rat learns a new trick in London, then this would affect the rat implicate order. So a rat in New York would learn the same trick quicker thereafter. And that's exactly what my ideas of morphic resonance predict, a kind of memory effect, a collective memory effect. So he would say this happens through introjection of experiences into the implicate order, which then unfolds them in other places and times and has a kind of inherent inbuilt memory. I would say this is a morphic resonance effect. And David Bohm and I completely agreed on the predictions, and we found we could translate from his language into mine and back again without losing any of these predictions. And for those who want to build bridges between these ideas and quantum theory, I think Bohm's interpretation of quantum theory is the most helpful starting point.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a fantastic answer. I followed it all. Bringing us slightly down to earth, Gavin Ritchie asks the question, if you look at quantum theory, it has actually had commercial exploitability, and apparently our satellites and our mobile phones and so on depend on that sort of physics. Is there anything in what you do, which is, you've slightly separated it from, but not entirely, from quantum theory, is there anything in the psychic or spiritual stuff you do which could become more popular or accepted by providing some commercial result? Or is that too down to earth a question?
Well, I mean, I have had, I did have an approach a few years ago from two gentlemen who came to visit me from Whitehall, and one turned out was from the Ministry of Defence, and the other, he didn't exactly say so, but it was fairly clear he was from MI5. And they asked if they could come and ask me some questions related to the defence of the realm. So I said yes, as a loyal citizen and so on, perfectly happy to meet them. And the first question was, he said, well, Dr. Sheldrake, you do research on telepathy. Let me come straight to the point. He said, if terrorists learn to communicate by telepathy, could we intercept it? So I said, well, no, you couldn't. In fact, it'd be a jolly good way for them to learn to communicate, because telepathy only works between people who are closely bonded. And in order to intercept it, you have to be really closely bonded. You have to infiltrate the terrorist group so much that you probably wouldn't need the telepathy. And then he said, so I said, no, you're not going to get far with that. And he then said, when we're using closed circuit surveillance systems on terrorists, could terrorists learn to know when they're being watched through CCTV? And I said, well, they probably could. They could probably train themselves to become more sensitive and therefore know when they're being watched. And he got quite interested in this, and then he was very bright. He said, well, would a time delay affect it? And I said, I don't know. He said, well, if it did, he said, we could have a device where you have a knob where you could have, say, a 10-second time delay if they don't detect it after a delay of 10 seconds, where you could watch them and they wouldn't know you were there. If you need to watch them in real time, you put it to real time. And he said, this could be really useful. In fact, he said, we could have this idea developed by our research and development branch. And he said, we could make millions selling this to Homeland Security in the United States. So there was a potential development, but I didn't want to go on working with them because a friend of mine, Dean Radin, who does a lot of this kind of research, advised me not to. He said, if you start working with them, at any point they could classify your research under the Official Secrets Act, and you wouldn't be able to publish it or discuss it. So I haven't followed up with them, and I'm not particularly interested in surveillance devices for Homeland Security. But that's one possible application. Telepathy itself is happening anyway, and I think that before the telephone was invented, it was was the only way people could communicate at a distance, and in many traditional societies they used this as actually was a very useful thing. So I think there could be commercial applications, and one idea that I have for telephone telepathy, where it could become at least lucrative, if not commercial, is to have a telepathy prize. Say there was somebody put up £10,000 for the National Telepathy Prize here in Britain. And to qualify for it, people would do my telephone telepathy test. People who can consistently score highly would then be tested under rigorous conditions in the semi-finals for this to find out the person who scores best. And then there'd be the finals live on TV, the most telepathic person in Britain, and they'd be presented with the £10,000 check. I think this would catch on in other countries, and indeed it could then lead to the Telepathy Olympics. And if there were a Telepathy Olympics and people had prestige and prizes for doing it, there'd be a big incentive to practice telepathy, which there isn't at the moment. People have an incentive to practice totally useless gymnastic skills in order to try and win the Olympics. And what I'm trying to do at the moment is find ways to train people to get better at telephone telepathy, working up towards local and then national telephone telepathy contests, and then working up to the Telepathy Olympics. That's my long-term plan.
I think that's completely marvelous. And once again, I mean, it's funny how these questions come up. The next question follows completely. It's from someone called Matthias, who's doing a comparative ethnography PhD. And he wonders what role morphic resonance can play when you have two distant tribes, okay, who have a different ability to preserve their nature-centered cosmology in spite of pressure from Western civilization to conform. So we assume they're separate and they're under equal pressure. They do different things. And would the morphic resonance enable them to connect with each other, rather like the rats you were talking about in London and New York, and change their ways simultaneously or some such?
Well, I think if we look at the history of human inventions, there's many, many cases where there are parallel inventions in different cultures. You know, pyramids in Egypt and in Central America. And in fact, people who've thought about this in the past have usually assumed that these cultural parallels must involve physical contact. Thor Heyerdahl did his famous Contiki experiments because he thought that cultures had traveled over the Pacific carrying cultural features with them. That's why he made his balsa wood raft and did the Contiki experiment. But with morphic resonance, you wouldn't need to have balsa wood rafts. You could have cultures picking up things from each other by morphic resonance. And in evolution, in biological evolution, there are many examples of parallel or convergent evolution. For example, marsupials in America and Australia have produced marsupial squirrels, marsupial wolves, marsupial mice, marsupial gerbils, etc., pouched mammals that have evolved quite independently and yet parallel to those elsewhere in the world. And in the history of science and ideas, there are many examples of parallel discoveries, like Newton and Leibniz discovering the calculus. These usually result in long squabbles, as it did in their case, about precedents, who did it first, and even accusations of plagiarism. But the fact is that if morphic resonance is happening, that becomes a real possibility. Now, I don't know how one would, it's very difficult to observe in the world today because even remote tribes have smartphones now and tuned into the World Wide Web and can look things up on Google. So it's very hard to find isolated cultures now where one could actually do these experiments. But it is possible to test for morphic resonance in a variety of ways, as I show, and has been tested with positive results, as I show in the new edition of A New Science of Life. I summarize 25 years of tests in different locations.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I think we're beginning to come to the end here. Just in case my battery runs out, I would just like to do a little moment before thanking you. And the little moment is simply to tell people about the other Tuesday talks that are coming up. At least 3 of the upcoming Tuesday talks before Christmas will continue this theme of the relationship between mind and body, consciousness and matter, what our minds can do and so on. The philosopher Philip Goff the amazing brain scientist Ian McGilchrist, and even I might have a thing or two to say, and others in the talks that are coming up. So this is a theme here that Rupert has started. So I would encourage all of you to come back. The last question, which I may be cut off before I'm able to hear the answer, but well, there are two questions. One was, will this recording be available for people to listen to? And the answer is, if this is all right with Rupert, certainly yes. People who haven't been able to come tonight will be able to see it, or those who have. The Arthur Conan Doyle Centre is willing to do that. And Scott,
yeah, that's fine with me.
Thank you very much indeed. And Scott is obviously the person to connect with in the centre. And the other thing is, it's a small question. Do you collaborate with anyone in the US? And I think the answer to that is yes as well, isn't it?
Yes, I'm a fellow of the Institute of Noetic Sciences in California. And the chief research scientist there is Dean Radin, who's a long-term colleague of mine. We've done some experiments and designed them together, and they're currently applying for a grant so they can do a large-scale follow-up experiment on telephone telepathy, taking up from where my own experiments have left off. So yes, I do, and I've collaborated with various other scientists in the United States as well. Yes. But principally at and through the Institute of Noetic Sciences.
Thank you very much. Well, the very last question isn't a question, it's just a comment, and it's been said by several people, the same comment. What a marvellous talk. Thank you very much indeed, Rupert. People have really enjoyed this, and lots of people are now repeating that one after another on the chat. So, I mean, this has been absolutely marvellous, and we're very, very grateful to you, and we hope you'll come back.
Thank you, Lance. A great pleasure to be with you.
Very well. Well, thank you very much. And Scott, are you going to close everything down now? Thank you very much.
Yes.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming, and we'll see you again soon. And again, thank you, Rupert. I'll be in touch.